So whenever I had clients coming into my office, I was always like, what do you want me to do today? Like, I just saw you a couple of days ago. Like, what the hell am I supposed to do now, right? So there's no way your physiology changes that fast. As you know, with any athlete, if you have an injury and you go see a healthcare provider and they don't really understand your sport as much as they should, they can't really give you the best recommendations. Think about all the crazy shit you've done to your fingers for 10 years. And this has only happened once. Your pulleys are fucking strong. Like, you know, to think that like that one pulley injury means that you need to stop climbing altogether is goddamn silly. That doesn't make any sense. Most people, when they're coming to the end of their capacity for a set or a wall, they're like stressing because their forearms do get pumped like that. But unless you're used to doing that all the time, you know, it's like it kind of increases your sympathetic response. So you probably even fatigue more quickly because your heart's pumping even harder based on the psychological stress. It's not the same velocity, right? It's not the same intensity. And so finding out, you know, what that velocity looks like on the climbing wall and finding out what it looks like on the campus board should give a coach a little bit better of an analysis or a better understanding of maybe we need to add load to your body if you're campusing because your velocity is too fast.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. Okay, Tyler, we're live on the podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm good, thank you.
It's good to have you on. So as I said, I don't do intros anymore. So we're just going to start with something out of left field. What's your favorite guitar band right now?
Ooh, my favorite band right now, man. I'm kind of like, I went and saw. I don't think that would be my favorite guitar band. We went and saw Lord Huron last weekend in New York, and I really like the songwriting of Ben. It's just incredible. But it's not too guitar-y, you know, it's more singer-songwriter, like beautiful mountain types of music.
Yeah.
But I've been listening to a lot of not guitar music really, other than when I'm playing or practicing myself, but listening to this mix band called Poolside.
Okay.
You ever heard of them?
I think I know. I think I've heard one song of them, but I'm not even sure if it was them or if it was I'm not sure. What do they play?
They just do like a mix of like popular songs, but it's just like more chill. Like, you know, we heard it when we were shopping in New York City, and I was like, what is this? And I was talking to this lady and she told me, and I've been like psyched about listening to them the last week.
It's pretty cool when you find it.
Out of my element. It sounded good.
Yeah, exactly. That's all it takes, right? You play quite a bit of guitar, right?
I try to when I can. I wouldn't consider myself necessarily that great at like understanding the guitar and like the theory and all that kind of stuff, but the actual technical, physical things I'm okay at.
Yeah. When did you start? When did you start playing?
I started playing when I was in high school. So when I was younger, my life was consumed with athletics, which, you know, because of that, I try not to do to my children, but I always wanted to like play the guitar. I was always jealous. Like when you're younger, I was always like an athlete, and people always say that, you know, everyone's jealous of the athletes. I was always jealous of the musicians. I was like, I want to do that, but I never had time to like spend to learn it, right? So I taught myself kind of learning how to play tablature or whatever. And then when I went to college, I was able to play way more, but I didn't play for 10, 15 years or something. And then this
Yeah.
last year, I was like, I'm buying myself an electric guitar, a sick electric guitar for Christmas.
That's a good way to jump back into it. And how do you do with, work-life balance? Are you good at switching off from work, or was that maybe an initiative to go in that direction?
It's a nice break from work for sure. The work-life balance is hard, as you know, for like owning your own business. And especially now that a lot of my business, the majority of it is done remotely, I can do it anywhere, which is a good and a bad thing. So that's why I was telling you about my speaker here that, is my sound system for my office.
Mm-hmm.
I usually try and practice when I'm at my office. So when I go home, my attention is, because I have kids. So I try to give them as much attention as I can when I go home.
Yeah, that's nice. Can you describe, a day in the life of Tyler? What does it look like?
Oh, geez. My day this morning, I got up at 5 o'clock and I went and I got a donut. It's priority number one. And I got some coffee and I went climbing at a local area. So 20 minutes from my house, drove up in the dark, have a headlamp or a spotlight, went and climbed for a couple hours until 8 o'clock, and then drove to my office. And I've been nonstop either talking on the phone or I had 2 clients in the office. And I will do that probably until 6 o'clock, and then I will go home. That's a typical day for me.
So when you're at the office, how do you split your time? Do you follow people? Do you follow, athletes online? Do you do more consulting? What's your role?
Normally my days now are booked like weeks in advance, where I will do like 2 or 3 phone calls in a row, usually 2. And then after that, there's usually like an hour or 90-minute break. And that's when I do the programming for those 2 people. And so it's really like every hour there's something until I leave work. And I try not to leave until I'm complete with all the things for the day, because then it becomes stressful. I can't think that I have things to do, and that stresses me out. And I don't want to carry it home, because then it doesn't work very well. So I try and complete those things at the office.
Were you always that organized with your time?
I mean, it's kind of like blended into that over time now that, post COVID. Well, in my clinic too, I, just out of school started a business, and the typical healthcare model for conservative medicine never really worked for me, and never really made a lot of sense to me, where you need to come in and get some intervention and you need to keep coming back all the time. I'm really interested in education, really interested in reading, research papers on what science thinks about, things that I should consider a specialty of mine. And so they don't really suggest that I need to see someone all the time. And they do suggest that most of that should be managed by the individual with some education. Mm-hmm. So whenever I had clients coming into my office, I was always like, what do you want me to do today? I just saw you a couple of days ago. What the hell am I supposed to do now? Right. So there's no way your physiology changes that fast. So that never really made a lot of sense to me, but it's hard to make a living and have that as your, primary mode of gaining income. And so I always kind of had this other thing that I was more interested in, teaching courses or doing consulting, remotely. And then when COVID came around, it just flipped upside down, where I don't very often see patients in my office anymore. It's mostly done remotely.
Yeah, because for those who don't know you, you're a chiropractor. Or you were trained.
That's what I have that's what I went to graduate school for, and then I did a 2 years master's degree at the same time, just because there was so much carryover. But yeah, the whole chiropractic thing is interesting because, my school that I went to was really much more modern, and it's very based on physiology and science. So I had a really, really good education on anatomy and physiology and pathology. It was taught by, the SmO2, which is a reputable medical school here, by their professors. And so the education component was really good, but the whole applications part, the whole chiropractic side of it, I grew up around a father who's a chiropractor who was very scientific as well, but that part never really made a lot of sense to me. So I didn't pay much attention to that part. And that was when I was more interested in strength conditioning. So I just read NSCA journals and research papers during those portions of my education. And then, kind of always wanted to go that route anyways.
what would you say today as if you do you call yourself a strength and conditioning coach? Would that be the title that you?
I probably, like it's interesting. Chiropractors like typically are considered like people that just treat spinal complaints, but my master's degree thesis was in tendon rehab.
Yeah.
So I like, for some reason, I don't know why, when I was in graduate school, I was really interested in understanding tendon rehabilitation and loading.
Mm-hmm.
And so the majority of my business now, probably 90% of it, is talking online with athletes who have finger injuries or have elbow and shoulder pain. Because it's, as you know, with any athlete, if you have an injury and you go see a healthcare provider and they don't really understand your sport as much as they should, they can't really give you the best recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the strength and conditioning research is stuff that I'm really interested in, and kind of blending that with the rehabilitation and the tendon loading research. And so through a couple different avenues of doing different podcasts with different people and coaching and doing conferences, I've kind of developed kind of a niche for that as the majority of my work right now.
Mm-hmm. What would you say chiropractic brings to your general practice as an added value? Something that, if somebody was maybe, let's say, a strength and conditioning coach interested in tendon health and rehab, and maybe all the same areas as you, but without the chiropractic background, what does that bring to your toolbox, let's say, in your job every day?
I mean, that's just the majority of what I do. The whole chiropractic thing, if you put two people like in a room nowadays, like someone that went like with the education that I got, and then a physical therapist as a DPT, and you put them in a room and someone comes in with some sort of pain complaint, you're not going to be able to tell them apart. They learn the same things and they do a lot of the same things.
Mm-hmm. Where
the question then is, are those things really as valuable as just more simple things like education and exercise?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I teach conferences for climbing coaches or, in other avenues, it's like coaches have a way bigger job in healthcare kind of indirectly than they think they do, because all I do for the majority of my work is like modify training programs, right? Because if you have an athlete that's injured and they go see someone that doesn't understand their sport, the recommendation is to stop doing their sport, right? And that doesn't make a lot of sense. And everyone knows that does sports, because they're not going to listen anyways. They're going to keep doing their sport. So we have to be a little bit more, and actually I just saw someone this morning who she's had shoulder pain for 3 months, and she saw someone that's a physical therapist that works with climbers as well. Mm-hmm. And they gave her like one thing to do, and they didn't even discuss like modifying her exercises on the climbing wall. And to me, that makes very little sense, right? And to apply some sort of therapies to her in the office has a very little like influence on the outcome of that pathology over a long period of time. So we, and they didn't do any imaging. I have a diagnostic ultrasound. So the one thing that's good for me as a chiropractor, and why I went that route for a couple different reasons, is I have a pretty big scope of practice, like in Utah, especially. Like I can order MRIs, I can order CT scans, I can use ultrasound, do diagnostics. So I have a good, I have a good reach for doing things, and in particular the ultrasound. So we actually ultrasound her shoulder. She had a split tear in her bicep tendon, which is like maybe problematic, maybe not, but still would be rehabilitative to start. Mm-hmm. But there's no way she can keep doing all the overhead volume on the climbing wall. She's not getting anywhere. It's a waste of her time, right? And so like I would assume that would have been the primary objective. But when it comes to healthcare and timing, you get paid on your time with a client, and so it kind of fucks everything up with like the kind of care that people get, which is it gets confusing. I don't know how much of that you've had in your life, but
I guess it's always depends who you go to see, and it depends what insurance you have and what it covers, and then how much of it you can do in a certain time frame. So there's all those, I guess from the outside, you look at them as arbitrary constraints on who you're allowed to see and why and when and how much, when really the rehab process should dictate who you should see and how much and when, rather than the allocated amount or hours for, say, like osteopath or physiotherapist or whatever it is that people go and do through their rehab. So I'm sure it's a broad topic that we could go at all day.
Yeah, there's lots of moving parts, but like the simplest way to think about it for me is like, I think at teaching people about the resiliency of their body is a real important priority.
Mm,
And then having a good understanding of the physiology and the pathology behind the most common things that you see, which for me, it's like, musculoskeletal complaints, specifically like tendon stuff.
mm,
And so giving them differentials, but it should be like an experience that like gives them options on what they can do, but it certainly should give them a direction, but it has to incorporate them participating in their sport in some
mm.
way, and then also doing things supplemental to it, and then it needs to progress and change, which I see way better outcomes with my clients if I consult with them, we talk on the phone like this with Zoom, and I have some really cool like applications. I have an Apple Pencil and my iPad and lots of visual stuff, and they can record the meeting, and then I write them a custom rehab program, right? And then say, try this, because you shouldn't expect your symptoms to go away in a couple days or when you leave the office. That makes no sense. So over a month's worth of time, you should see some trend that's improving on a regular like tracking method, right? And teaching them all the pieces, but it's not as complicated as people are led to believe, right? And that's one of the things that is really confusing for individuals going to different healthcare providers. Like some of the worst patients, or the hardest patients, I guess not worst, is people that have multiple opinions.
Mm.
That's a hard like patient to actually help because they're fucking confused. Just simple as that.
Would you say that pain plays a big role in adding complexity and the difficulty through the rehab process? The idea that you have to manage that thing that's called pain, that sometimes has a let's say a root cause. Sometimes it's just something that's gotta come and it should have gone, but it hasn't, and now it's there, and it maybe shouldn't be, and maybe has no grounds to be there. And then navigating that. I mean, speaking for myself, I hurt my back like 2 years ago, and then I was definitely overworked and I was definitely under recovering, and I just dragged that thing on forever for like a year and a half. And then all it took was sleeping better and then starting to be active again for it to start to subside. And now it's much, much better. But the fear element of like it hurts and it's going to hurt more if I do something was such a big mental block for me. Do you find that being a hurdle for some of your clients?
Oh, every client for sure. Especially if the pain is associated with some sort of activity. And a lot of times with climbers, they'll be climbing and then they shift their position. They actually change the direction of the load on their pulley, which is like perpendicular to the tendon with a little bit of velocity. And they hear like this popping noise, and then they have pain like over this proximal phalanx. But it's really, alarming and like scary in the moment. But just when you sit someone down that's like been climbing I talked to someone this morning, been climbing for 10 years, climbing at a really high grade. He's had a pulley, pop, which you hear pulley rupture. All you have to do is say, think about all the crazy shit you've done to your fingers for 10 years. And this has only happened once. Your pulleys are fucking strong. Like, to think that like that one pulley injury means that you need to stop climbing altogether is goddamn silly. That doesn't make any sense. Like based on like just tissue quality, right? Like the connective tissues are so strong. And I think probably that like for me, just maybe as a side note, but related, the best thing I ever did for my education was when I was in anatomy in school. I had a really good opportunity to like do full cadaver dissections the first 2 years of my graduate school. And it was like, I just like absorbed the shit out of it. And I spent so much time like teaching students in my class about anatomy, and then was a TA for 4 years, and then was a teacher after. Like that experience was so much more valuable than any of the like chiropractic things that I learned, because it really teaches you about like all the components of your body and how damn strong they are, right? It's amazing how resilient our system is to mechanical stress and how adaptable it is. And so when people have pain experiences they have pain with a experience like a sport, kind of disconnecting the idea that that sport is dangerous is a really big priority, and that's, again, it's like, that's all education. You can't force that on someone, and that's why in-person visit stuff is like, sure, we can do things, but honestly, when someone comes into my office, the person today, they sit right there on my couch, and I bring up Zoom on my computer, and I use the same things that I do when I'm doing it remotely.
They should have stayed home.
Yeah, they're like, why the fuck am I sitting here? I can just drink coffee in my house, but I have like coffee here, whatever, we make it convenient. But I use the ultrasound in person and we can demonstrate some exercises, but that stuff is pretty easy to get across, remotely too.
Mm-hmm. So if we talk about tendon health and tendon rehab, maybe as a primer before this, can you maybe explain the commonalities between muscle tissue and tendons, and then also their differences, and then we can go into the tendon rehab stuff.
Yeah, I think an easy way to think about it is like the muscle lives in the middle of your tendon. Because like if you read textbooks, textbooks will say that muscles, tendons attach muscles to bones, but it kind of neglects the idea that there's a tendon at both sides of your muscle. And then the actual collagen is continuous through the muscle. And that's like what's the extracellular matrix, the honeycomb outside the muscle. So it could be considered as one continuous thing. But the easy way to think about it is just naturally tendons are not flexible. They're very resistant to stretch. They're really strong, like way stronger than, steel or things that we can recreate. And so the muscle's naturally always flexible. That's what it's designed to do. And so one of the biggest, at least injury mechanisms that we see in sports is just lots of sport volume, because the sport itself has a lot of velocity and change of direction loading and, a lot of volume, a lot of repetitions. And so that repetitive high velocity twisting stuff is more stressful on connective tissue than things like strength training. And so kind of the simple answer to, complaints like that is that's why everyone does strength training pretty simply in some form, in some dosage, right? And that's where kind of the science meets the art of the coaching and the practical experience of like trying things on people and seeing how people respond. But as you know, with programming, it's like, you can't just do like this thing and expect this one thing to be done by everyone and to have an effect on someone, because everyone is so different. So one of the things I always joke with people, if you go to a clinic, like a PT clinic or a doctor's office, whatever, and you leave with the packet that you need to do, that's a red flag, right? Because who the fuck do they know? They don't know you, right? Like, how is that specific to you, right? It's very general, right? And those general recommendations just are not that useful for the individual, right? It's just like so much unlearning needs to happen in a lot of ways, with healthcare.
Is this stuff you would do to heal and rehab a tendon that would be counterintuitive if we compare it to what we would do for a muscle, for example?
Muscles, if there's like a muscle tears tend to be way less problematic just because there's a ton of blood. There's a lot of blood supplied to your muscle automatically. And that's an interesting topic because there's not really good evidence to show that tendon injuries really heal and go away. So it's likely you've heard of like I think it was Craig Purdom who came up with the analogy, maybe, and probably botched the date, maybe 2012 or something, like focus on the donut, not the hole. That idea is, when they see tendon injuries and they follow up with athletes with tendon injuries decades later, they still have the same pathology for the most part. There's some changes in the tendon, some, cross-sectional area changes, which is like blood flow and denervation. Those things will change a little bit, but the injury is still there. So the rehabilitation kind of shift there is now on, don't treat them like they're a hurt person with an injured tendon, like load them like an athlete. We're going to modify how we're going to load them, but there's still more healthy stuff than injured stuff. That's where like the donut analogy comes from, is there's more donut than there is hole. So it's kind of a perspective shift, which is, largely education, but it certainly, guides loading and suggestions for, different types of interventions as well. But, and like this gal this morning with her shoulder complaint, I know, maybe a dozen climbers that have, labral tears. It's really common in climbers, and to have, proximal bicep injuries as well. And they'll just tear on their own. And then the individual can decide whether they want to have surgery or not. But a lot of times surgeons will recommend that they just keep loading. And if they tear, they tear. But most of the time they won't, because the tissue's too strong.
So when you say loading, is there a certain way to load a tendon? Is there a certain way not to load a tendon?
Yeah, there's good evidence for a couple different types of loads. Like the classic, or the first like real studied loads, are eccentric loads. A lot of that research came on the Achilles tendon or the patellar tendon, which is what I did the majority of my stuff with in grad school, is on the patellar tendon and Achilles tendon. So they would do heavy negatives, but most of the protocols are like 5 sets to 8 sets of like 15 reps of an eccentric. But the important thing about that time frame, that 15 reps, is that's a total time under tension of around like 45 seconds, around that number. And so there's also research showing that heavy resistance training, which is just like heavy and slow, does the same thing, gets the similar outcomes, because still around 45 seconds. And there's also research to show that isometric holds or static loads for that same time frame also is helpful. So the cool thing about that is it gives people flexibility in terms of the program, or the coach or the rehab practitioner gives people options for choosing loads. So from my perspective, it really comes down to compliance. And the one thing that I saw with like lots of eccentric loading, it depends on the body part, but it can be quite a pain in the ass if you're trying to do it for the elbow. Because most people, when they do eccentrics, they don't do them with enough load. They do just slow, they're just doing slow, negatives, but they're not really loading them appropriately, right? So if you're going to do it on the elbow, you have to like have a load that's too heavy, and you got to do this. So you got to like carry it around with you. It's just not practical in a lot of ways. So I usually start with isometrics just because they're really simple. And for a rock climbers spend a lot of time doing them anyways, and I can put climbers in positions that look more like their sport, and we can load them for specified time periods. And I see better results with that, simply because that kind of uses part psychology and part physiology, physical stuff, and kind of, makes the athlete feel more comfortable in a position that they're familiar with. And that tends to be pretty confidence building.
Do you have to play with different joint angles then when you're doing those isometrics for the elbow, for example? Is that what comes to mind is that 15 degree plus or minus 15 degree rule of kind of transfer in the different ranges that we're going to be playing with? Is that something that you apply as well?
Yeah, for sure. So lots of 90 and 120 degree, range lock offs, or, doing partial range pulling in that range as well. But then if it's like a shoulder complaint, like this gal today, we got to find a way to minimize overhead activities for her. So for her, it's like, we're not doing it like this. We're going to do inverted versions, right? So she's using like a bar this way, or grabbing onto a steep climbing wall where she leans back and holds on. So we're doing like hex bar deadlifts or shoulder shrugs, like load the shit out of the shoulder, in my opinion, slow and heavy, but we're just going to avoid the provocative positions. And like she was able to do that in the office with no symptoms, right? But it's so easy, right? But that, for me, it seemed so easy because like I like spent so much goddamn time like being obsessed with like anatomy and physiology, where it's just like becomes second nature, which is really cool. Which like for me, it seems really easy. And then I say that into coaches when I'm doing courses and such, and it's hard for me to connect the points why it's not so easy for them to see it as well. But that's something that I've kind of learned to work on with myself over time, is like understanding that, people maybe don't have that same background, which is, kind of, you got to slow down sometimes and take the extra time to teach people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have an idea of the mechanism behind why do you have to load the tendon, whether it's, like you said, heavy eccentrics or just essentially long time at attention or isometrics? What's going on during that hold that is able to I guess affect the tendon in a positive way?
There's a couple papers. There's one, and then like a revisiting paper of Joe Cook's and Craig's, where they do the concept of stress shielding. So stress shielding is like this idea where if you have like the donut in the hole analogy, you have some tendon injury in the middle of a tendon, or at the tendon bone attachment or muscle tendon attachment. If we don't load like more tissue, your body is smart enough. If we don't intentionally load more muscle fibers, your body's smart enough that it'll work around the injury. So a lot of the movement pattern changes that happen with something like shoulder pain, this gal, I could just see, like when we were doing just natural things in the office, just like doing an ultrasound, like she's really hesitant to reach her arm overhead. And so one of the things that we see with rehab, and which I totally disagree with, is trying to like work all this passive range of motion to get them to do all the things passively, like in a clinic. Like, to me, that makes no sense, because that's all like upstairs stuff. Like, our bodies are really good at protecting us, and it will continue to do that until the individual feels ready to do it. And as soon as they do, I find that range of motion will come back exactly like it was. Like, it's not reasonable to lose your range of motion forever. That doesn't make any sense. So part of the reason when it comes to like stress shielding, why we want that long time under tension is because we want a lot of recruitment. Because we're going to assume that if someone's using 75% MVIC or MVC and they're spending 45 seconds of time under tension, they're getting a really high level of recruitment. And because the muscle is in the middle of my tendon, if I'm getting high recruitment, as these fibers crawl together, I'm putting load on the tendon at both sides. And so part of like, not Craig Purdom, or Keith Barr's work on like tendon loading and reducing stiffness comes from, using the viscoelastic properties of the tendon and loading it slowly and statically and creating that shear stress on the tendon. And that tends to reduce some of that stiffness. So a lot of times when people do strength training interventions with modified ranges of motion or in some progressive way, they feel like their injured body part is stretched out more. It feels less tight, right? And the tightness is weird. I don't know how much you've talked to people or studied about tightness, but tightness is like a sensation, just like pain. It's very mysterious.
Yeah, it seems to sometimes be localized. Sometimes it's broader. Sometimes it comes in. I feel like the more I go forward and the more I pay attention to myself, the more I can maybe explain why I'm tight or what's making me tight and maybe what's helping me get out of it as well. But then some days you just have no clue. You didn't do anything. And then, for example, I don't know, my right hamstring is just going to have like a ball in the middle of it. I'm like, why? I didn't do anything to you. But it's pretty interesting. How do you manage when we're talking about loading a tendon that, like you said, there was an issue there, or there is an issue there, and so there might be some pain that's manifested as well. How do you work through that with the loading? Do you work through the pain? Is there a threshold, like a 0 to 10 threshold that you don't want to exceed while you're doing the work? Is it the next day? Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, there's a couple of different, like, I think trains of thought there in the rehab world where some people will try and push into it, which would be considered like, I think, Greg Lehman, who's like, when I was out of school, like he was like someone that I really paid attention to when I was in school. I have a lot of respect for him because he's a chiro and a PT, but a researcher that worked for Stuart McGill and is like just a funny guy, but like he fucking is super smart. And he's not like, so he like is very creative with how he like plays with, these discussions, whatever. And so I took a course from him when I was right out of school. And I think he calls it edge work, where it's like, you're trying to like push people into that point to like, just so they maybe know that it's comfortable. And so they're like, oh, that's kind of scary. But then say, how do you feel afterwards? Like, how do you feel the next day? Was it really that scary? Was it really like that concerning? So that's more like confrontation therapy. And then the other side of that would be like giving someone something that they're in control of completely. And that's another thing that isometric exercise works pretty good for. Because if I have someone that's just scared to load, like taking them into that range of motion where they're scared passively is not going to make them any less scared. But if I can have them work into that range that's comfortable for them, let's say like the shoulder, like doing external rotation, like do it into a wall and just push to comfort level. And a lot of times in my office, when people come in, we'll do isometric testing. And the isometric testing can be like, it can swing both ways. It can be really helpful if they pull on one side and they're like, okay, and they pull on the other side and they're not that different. You say, wow, look how strong you are. Like that didn't hurt. You're only 15% deficit on the injured side, right? It can also go the other way though. If it's a huge deficit and they see the number, they're like, oh, fuck, that's like 65% less. Like my shit is really bad, right? So like, it's kind of hard to navigate, right? So it's like part reading the person and like, is that person going to be freaked out about this or are they going to be cool with it, right? So that's when like the customization is so essential because it's, there's not a right or wrong way, I don't think, but there's just lots of options. And that's when like the art comes into like, doing rehab programs. But there's good evidence to say that isometrics are more analgesic than other types of loading. So Jill Cook, who's another, well known like rehab specialists would say isometrics are a really good place to start because they've been shown to make people hurt less. And a lot of people are, the priority for patients is to hurt less. The priority for the practitioner is to like keep them loading, and so that's another, so I have kind of a bias towards isometrics in that sense for loading. But yeah, there's options.
Do we know why they have that analgesic effect?
I think they're mostly like just psychological, just as confidence, just doesn't feel scary, right? And they can get that long time under tension, and they can get a change in like the blood flow to the tissue in real time, and they can get more recruitment. So I think a lot of the, the intensity that comes with doing those types of movements, when they don't know how hard they're pushing or pulling, it's usually higher than they think that it is. And so they're probably getting more tendon load. And so that will, have impacts on the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs, and a lot of like that neural component of allowing a little bit more force, but it's not really, we don't know exactly. Researchers are still like, there's a couple primary hypotheses behind like the ingrowth of nerves as being sensitizing for tendon pain, because there is blood flow that comes with like chronic pathologies and, alongside nerves. So there's lots of, a couple of primary mechanisms, lots of sensitivity that comes with tendon pain though.
You mentioned blood flow a couple of times there. So shifting gears, when did you start getting interested in blood flow as it relates to climbing performance?
Blood flow is in like BFR.
I was more thinking on the side of muscle oxygenation and
the SmO2 stuff.
Yeah.
I think Max and I chatted about it a couple of years ago. Max Schmarzo, Strong by Science.
Okay.
We were chatting about it one time, and then, he's like, this is something that you should really look into. And I've definitely heard about it before and looked into it, but those units are not cheap, right? Like I think my 3-unit bundle is like $3,000. I think like $4,000 with the computer and everything into it. So it's not really that expensive, but it's, not cheap anyways. But it's something that like you have to spend time, because it's so new, right? You got to like keep learning about it and keep like, we just had a Moxy summit that I have been driving and listening to. And so there's so much to learn there. It's like fucking going back to school. You're like, I guess I have to go back to school and learn about all this stuff now, because all the stuff that I learned was outdated.
Yeah. And there's, I feel like there's still very little things to point to and to look at in that field. I mean, there are lots of papers and more coming out with, using NIRS in different situations, but as it relates directly to performance and how to apply it, I feel like it's still a very niche field. And like you said, there's not a lot of info on it. And so, like you said, this Moxy summit that just went by, it's like probably 10 hours, 12 hours of content from, all the world experts. And that's probably like all the best stuff that's currently available on the topic. And like you said, it's like a whole new, okay, now I need to go back to, the drawing board, or at least update everything that I think that I know with this, because it's taking it a step farther.
Right. And you're getting like zero answers from the conference too. You're like, okay, well. So for me, it's like, what are the things that when I teach conferences, I try not to be prescriptive as more as I am like conceptual. Cause for me, like, as long as people can understand like the, basic physiology and the principles behind it, like being flexible with it is exactly what any sort of avenue or sport needs, to just like try things in different ways with some sort of sound, like, background of why they're doing that. And then, then as it starts to grow, people get interested and they do more research on it. So NIRS is kind of like one of those things where you watch that summit, you're like, wow, that's kind of cool. Like, I kind of like that. I've never heard of that before. So you can kind of like piece all these things together and start being more playful with it. But I've definitely spent time chatting with Evan Pycon as well, and doing some, some talks with him about, because he seems to really know that stuff quite well. And I'm really impressed with his like, understanding of the like cardiopulmonary physiology stuff. And so when you use it on an individual, I think is what everyone would say is really useful. So it's really hard to like take a group of people, and we did this with 30 climbers at my office maybe a year ago or maybe 6 months ago. It's really hard to take a group of people and measure their NIRS stuff, even if at the same intensity, and make like these conclusions. Right. But for an individual, it's really pretty cool. And I use it a lot in my office for either like suggestions on intensity for an intervention or how to modify that, or like I had a really interesting case study yesterday where we used it on someone that's been a client of mine with a finger injury, and it's been like 4 months of his finger injury. And so his finger injury is like, for the most part, recovered. He has no pain. He wants to start trying hard. So what we did was we used the Moxy monitors on both arms, and then we had him do a fingerboarding protocol. But what's really interesting is you can see the trend. So it's pretty safe to say now, if you look at a Moxy trend, you're looking at a DSAT trend, that's pretty good sign of how hard the muscle's working, which means how much intensity is going on. So he had this like notable asymmetry side to side, right? Yeah. And his finger's been sore. So he's been, for whatever reason, like not loading it as much or not prioritizing, but he wasn't getting as much blood flow. He wasn't getting as much recovery. So a simple shift, like I had him use a bigger edge and a smaller edge here, we just shifted the focus to the bigger edge on his right hand, and they equalized a little bit more. So that, like, people feel that, right? People feel asymmetries, or they feel like this side doesn't feel as strong as this side. And, a lot of times we can say, well, sorry, that sucks. There's nothing we can do about it. But with the Moxy, you can say, I don't know. Let's really see if there's as much activity, right? Assuming that you're getting them in the same location. But there's all sorts of weird moving anatomy pieces too that are variable, so lots of questions, but I think there's really cool uses for it, but it's very like individual, I think, like test.
Yeah. So you use it in those cases. You talked about asymmetries. You talk about coming back from an injury and looking at those different trends. Is there other practical cases that you like to apply them to?
Lots of injury stuff. Like, the cool thing is you can put them on different body parts, anywhere really you can keep it tight. A lot of times, like with climbers, I'll use them to like try and demonstrate like activity, kind of like to maybe question common myths that people have about climbing. Like, one of the myths is that like we use our finger flexors so much, these are really weak. And if we get a finger injury, it's because these are weak, right? Yeah. Which is like, that's one of the assumptions that people say for whatever reason. And so when you can measure that directly with a NIRS device, put a Moxy on the front, Moxy on the back, and measure it. And so it turns out that like the grip position really matters, but when you're doing a full crimp with your wrist and extension, there's a pretty high activity in the extensor compartment every time you do that. So the question that I would ask people is, if we feel like those muscles are weak and inhibited, whatever, and we have an injury, is working them more, giving them more volume intentionally a good solution, or is that a practical solution, or is that just going to make them more fatigued? Because it's probably not like a strength thing, because there's not like this, cross body symmetry that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I like using it for stuff like that, or like, the other one that I've done recently is put the Moxy on like the upper pec fibers, on the clavicular fibers of the pec, because a lot of climbers think that like bench pressing is like either not a useful intervention, or it's like, gonna like injure their shoulders or something. And so it turns out that like if you actually measure the pec use on the climbing wall on steep terrain, it's pretty high. Yeah. You use the pec a lot with overhead movements, and that's not something that rock climbers tend to do a lot of or enough of, in my opinion. So I think they're, it's fun to like just play with them in kind of a case by case basis. But
you said before you had a lot of questions. What are your biggest outstanding questions regarding whether it's the tech or reactions that you've maybe seen and not been able to explain? Because that's always the thing, is that we have, as we move forward, we have a better and better understanding of what we're seeing and why we're seeing it. And I think this year's summit is bringing a lot of answers, especially in the endurance field, as we can look at different SmO2 trends and relate them to intensity domains and those kind of things, which I think is fascinating. But again, there's always the outlier. There's always the situation where something happens and you can't explain it. You don't really know what's going on. So what would be your biggest big question mark still on whether it's the technology or its application?
You mean specifically for using the SmO2 stuff, for using the Moxy? Yeah. Like the thing that always gets, like, and me and Evan talked about this a bunch, is whether it's like you're getting a real venous occlusion, which is the cause of like the changes, or whether it's like matching the correlation with the vasodilation. Yeah. So how good that ratio is of the trend dropping and the capacity of your nervous system to vasodilate and get blood flow to the tissue. And so he showed me a pretty cool method that I think makes good sense, that has been studied in a couple different papers, where it's no exercise and you just like create full occlusion in a limb for 2 minutes, and then do the delta SmO2, the rate of decline, and then also, track that for a minute of recovery. And this same client that I mentioned earlier with the finger injury, like he just had less utilization on the right side and less blood flow overall for recovery. And that's probably a consequence of an injury that has come, and he's been, maybe unintentionally being less forceful on that side. So he's done less time under tension overall, which has implications for all energy system use, all like oxygen, delivery and consumption, et cetera. So it's kind of cool for individuals, because now we're going to shift, not change everything about his training program and do more reps on that side. We can make small adjustments, like make this hand work a little bit harder than the other hand. And hopefully we can, balance those out a little bit, because he's a sport climber. And so he needs a lot of, ability to hang on with both arms. But, so I think the individual stuff is where it becomes really kind of cool. But when I look at group data on 30 people, I'm like, I don't have any idea how this is helping me understand anyone's physiology, because they're all so different. They're all so different.
We're all going to have individual differences, and even like you said, even from one arm to the other. You talked about maybe less use on one side due to an old injury, something like this. Is that where maybe BFR might come into play? I know you use BFR quite a bit, and so is that a situation where that piece of equipment might become useful?
I think this individual for sure would benefit by using some BFR application. Just like I would say, but we would do it on both arms. I don't know that would be one. I mean, you could do different edge size, completion, reps to failure, to maybe put a little bit more force on that side, which I think makes sense. And we'll probably do that. But we'll, because I haven't finished his program yet, but when it comes to building efficiency for using oxygen, that's where BFR I think can be really helpful. And there's good evidence on the angiogenic effects as well, so getting good capillary density and et cetera. So I have a lot of climbers that are really excited and use BFR frequently for that reason. The BFR is interesting because there's good science behind the metabolic effects, but the psychological effects I think are really helpful for a sport like climbing, where most people, when they're coming to the end of their capacity for a set or a wall, they're stressing because their forearms do get pumped like that. But unless you're used to doing that all the time, it's it kind of increases your sympathetic response. So you probably even fatigue more quickly because your heart's pumping even harder based on the psychological stress. So training people under that circumstance is kind of hard to do. With not deteriorating someone's skills too much. And so BFR is a really easy way to make someone just pumped out of their mind and make them hang on their fingers, right?
I'd never actually thought of that, but it makes total sense from, like you said, the mind side of things. And if you could just spend more time feeling it and doing it, and like you said, seeing that you're okay, it's pumped, but you're going to survive and you can hang on, then again, on the wall is going to translate.
Yeah. There's lots of climbers that will just tell me that anecdotally, I got pumped as hell, but I could just keep going. I was like, that's cool, because normally when you get pumped, you're like, oh shit, I'm nervous. But then if you try and train that too much, and one of my questions that I ask when people are doing lots of what would be considered capacity types of training interventions on the climbing wall, they tend to do a lot of volume. So they'll do a boulder problem, if you're familiar with the length, they'll do 4 in a row, and then they'll rest, and then they'll do that again. But in order to complete the workout, they have to drop the intensity. Yeah. But then because the intensity is lower, they can do more volume. And then it's kind of this hard understanding of how much volume is too much volume, because you're doing a lot of the most risky things, which is a lot of velocity, a lot of change of direction, and a lot of volume in a set, where those can be tricky for finger and elbow and shoulder injuries as well in climbers, because you have to pick terrain that you can do it on, and they tend to have more velocity towards the end of their workouts because they're getting tired. So the skills kind of go down, the velocity goes up, but that's not the same thing as being powerful like when you're fresh, and so that's another thing I've been really having fun with lately is, trying to teach climbers more about like some velocity based training, because those concepts, like when I went to the University of Missouri, I knew Brian Mann, like that worked with the football team. He worked there when I was there. And like that dude is so smart. Like I love listening to that guy talk, and I'm really interested in that stuff. That stuff makes a lot of sense to me with performance stuff. And that is not something that climbing has done at all.
I want to come back to VBT. I know we have a few more minutes. Something just came through my mind. If we talk about capacity or endurance for climbing, is there any place, it might be completely stupid what I'm saying here, but bear with me. Is there any place for a positive incline wall where you wouldn't be under, but you would be over and doing, spending a lot of time, but at those lower intensity? If we think about, if we think about endurance sports, they spent a lot of time under their first threshold to build all those qualities that are going to enable them to be metabolically efficient during their event. Is there a place for that in climbing, to do essentially very light climbing, but still quite demanding on the forearm, on the arms, and do it for extended periods of time? Is that even a thing?
Yeah, people do that for sure. Yeah, for sure. That's something that's called arc training, which is like very low intensity, climb up until you're pumped and then back off, kind of clearance type of, staying below your threshold. Okay. That is done. The other thing that I was thinking of, and there's also like different, lots of angles of terrain that people climb on, but where I thought you were going originally was like speed climbing. Like, speed climbing makes sense to not make the wall vertical and tip it a little bit more of a decline so they can literally increase their speed, their velocity.
It's like over speed training.
And there's good science to say that that's a good idea. And I think I've seen maybe 1 or 2 walls maybe that have done that, but that makes sense from a practical standpoint. But with the velocity stuff, the one thing that climbers do a lot of is they'll climb at a specific wall angle and they'll do powerful things, but then they'll go to this other tool, which is a campus board, which is, most of them are fixed at like 15 degrees. And then they'll do these moves without their feet on, right? And the assumption that they're making is that that's making them more powerful, right? And the argument that I would say that doesn't make sense is it's not the same velocity, right? It's not the same intensity. And so finding out, what that velocity looks like on the climbing wall and finding out what it looks like on the campus board should give a coach a little bit better of an analysis or a better understanding of, maybe we need to add load to your body if you're campusing because your velocity is too fast. Maybe we need to put your feet on the wall because your velocity is too slow to so trying to use a training tool a little bit more specifically to the individual is something that climbing hasn't really gotten into yet, because we just use the same old things that people have been using for years. And, I'm kind of on the other end where I hear about people getting injured from using those tools, right? So I'm always like, oh, maybe we should use that in a different way. Not that they don't work. It's just that we can definitely be better with how we use them.
Yeah. So talk about VBT for a few minutes. I was lucky enough to talk to Brian on the podcast a couple months ago. Fantastic guy. And I recommend the conversation to anybody interested. So VBT, how do you apply it to climbing?
So what I've been trying to do lately, and this is pretty maybe since COVID kind of was less stringent, I've been doing it more because I obviously didn't have a lot of in-person contact in 2020. But we've been trying to use the Gym Aware, or there's this other Vitruve Fit unit that I have, and we'll use a couple different, directions, vertical direction, to the right, to the left, have different wall angles, and just get a general sense of how quickly someone's moving, right? And I try not to don't change how they're moving, just do your normal habit. But then really I want them to find a powerful move for them that's hard for them on a specific wall angle. And then we're going to take that velocity and then we're going to try and find that velocity, because if they want to be powerful and they want to work capacity at that for the climbing wall, it makes sense to use a similar velocity. So then we'll go test their fingers or test their pulling strength or bench pressing, whatever, and match the load or try and find the load that they move at that same velocity. And to me, that makes sense that you're going to get a better transfer if we do that instead of just doing a lower velocity with more load, right? At some point in their training cycle. And so then we can use that measure as well and we can use things like a campus board where people use them for power training and be a little bit more specific with individuals on how they're using the tool. Because in climbing, you can be overly powerful. You can be too powerful. We had a client that we tested, or a participant in the course this last weekend. He is so powerful. And so for him, he probably, in watching him climb, he actually goes past the hold because he comes at it with so much more velocity. So it could be like even a technical thing, like he needs to slow down a little bit. So adding load to his body,
Load him
not
up,
on the climbing wall, but like on a campus board or something, you know, kind of slowing him down a little bit makes sense. So I think it's kind of a thing, something that I've learned about a lot from Brian and other sports that I'm just now like trying to apply to climbing, and, you know, hopefully people will, you know, find some value in like that analysis.
You talked before about overspeed on a speed climbing route. Would you apply overspeed to, you know, basic power movements as well on a normal climbing wall, with maybe, you know, being pulled from above and things like that?
I mean, it's hard to say because like the speed climbing is all about the speed. Like they want to get faster. Where climbing, you don't necessarily want your moves to get faster necessarily. Maybe the tempo of like the effort might make more sense to speed up a little bit. If someone's climbing really slow and they're falling off 3/4 of the way, maybe they might benefit by increasing the tempo of their movement a little bit. But I don't know, but that could be practiced on the climbing wall. You know, I don't know that we would need to like really, I mean, maybe some people do that. I know people have tried to do that with speed climbing, maybe where they pull them up, like, you know, to overspeed train them. And maybe people have done that on the climbing wall on routes. It's possible, but the clipping thing is always kind of annoying too. So
yeah, sorry to cut you off. I was thinking of more like a single move, like I think it's called a dyno or something like that, where you have a single explosive move. And I was just thinking, you know, like you said, overspeed, they pull people in sprinting because it allows you to attain a higher percentage, or even sometimes go over your max velocity. So I was thinking maybe on a single move like that, would it make sense to pull someone a little bit to allow them to actually function at a higher rate in that one instance?
Yeah, I think in some cases it makes sense for people to know what that's like to like be poppy and be snappy. So yeah, I think, and people do that. People will do like dynamic training with a campus board with their feet on and let their feet cut when they go high. So for me, the interesting thing is like thinking about the ballistic versus the non-ballistic version, where climbers do more non-ballistic power training than ballistic, like a jumping athlete that are always ballistic. Climbers have to slow down. And so I think if we mess with the velocity too much, right, it's gonna like mess with their deceleration, which is like 50% of the movement, right? It's like big part of the movement. So if we do dyno training only, or dyno, you know, like feet off climbing only, it's gonna fuck up their like technical skills for power. And so for me, it kind of made sense to kind of find their normal power habit and find that velocity, and then maybe try and spend more time focusing on those loads at, you know, higher velocities. Or, you know, the other thing, as Brian probably talked about, that climbers definitely don't do, with a few exceptions, is adjust their training loads every day. Right? You know, it's very old school in the sense that I'm a little bit stronger today than I was yesterday, so I'm gonna crush shit, right? And then you get hurt. So it's like it's not easy to adjust the training loads unless you have the understanding of how quality the load is, or whether you can, you know, move at the same speed, whatever.
Tyler, I know you have a meeting in a couple minutes, so I'm gonna let you go. Where can people find out more about what you do if they wanna?
I'm kind of bad with like we talked about before. I use Instagram, but I don't use Facebook ever. I have a YouTube channel I started, but I'm too busy now, so I don't mess with that. There's some videos on there on YouTube, but Instagram is the easiest way to, you know, see what I'm doing. I've tried to like at least stop it at one, which is maybe a bad thing, but, you know, as you know, you don't have time to do all that stuff. I don't know.
Exactly. It's a job in and of itself. Tyler, thanks again for coming on the podcast. It was a great pleasure to chat with you today, man.
You're welcome. Cheers. Good luck with your Instagram. Hopefully they help you out.
Thank you.